shelter, you typically have round-the-clock staffing. So let's say it's in a congregate space, you have 3 shifts that you're having to cover there. If you're opening up a shelter, you have to bring in the showers and the bathrooms and all that kind of stuff. So even if you do it in what you think of as a low-cost thing, like a tent city or something like that, like a little tent village, you have to level, you have to, there's all the stuff that's up front, but then there's the staffing costs that are a lot more intensive. And so, and it also isn't faster. And so a lot of people think that, well, when we do acquisitions, so we did a bunch of, one of the cool things that kind of came, one of the cool things, it sounds so weird saying that, pandemic was a nightmare. Silver lining is that we had tourist hotels that were suddenly available, right? And so we've been able to do these acquisitions. There was actually a couple buildings that that was acquired with Prop C money that were going to be like tech worker housing, and then there's been like some student housing, some youth hostels, all these different things. You can acquire those much quicker than you can set up a shelter. And there's doors that lock, etc. So you don't need the same level of staffing. And so it's faster, it's often, and then there's, so even with the creation of new units, so acquisitions, you're buying a building, you get people in quick, even if you're spending a bunch of money, if you put it out on a spreadsheet over years and owning the building, the operating costs are so much lower, you end up saving money there. So it's not faster, it's not cheaper. Okay, so what you want, and what I was, nothing's, you're still homeless.
Just to ask a clarifying question on that. One of the folks that spoke actually said that it was a great mistake for the city to buy all these properties because now there's no money for leasing. And that there was such an upfront cost. Do you guys remember that? Mm-hmm. There was such an upfront cost in buying all these buildings that now there isn't money to do these longer term leases because all the money was spent into purchasing these places. And so there's not $1 left to purchase a new unit. This is what was told to us. Is that true?
No, no, because all the purchases happened because of Prop C generates $300 million a year. That's ongoing. And then with the lawsuit, Prop C, those funds were held up in court. They couldn't be released, but they were being collected into the fund. So we had $600 million in a fund, but you really can only use those as one time. So it doesn't create an opportunity to do leasing into the future because it's not an ongoing revenue source. It's a one-time revenue source because it was from those first 2 years. So naturally, you're then going to want to use those for one-time costs. So,
so you couldn't use those for leases, that money?
Well, you could, but you'd run out. You'd only have lease for a couple years, or 3 or 5 years, or whatever it broke out to. And then after the 5 years, you wouldn't have the income source to continue those leases. And so, the smart thing to do is to use it for acquisitions. So then you're driving down your costs, and then you don't have the leasing costs. You just have the operating costs, so maintenance and you don't have the loan cost. All of that stuff. So you have the staffing costs ongoing, but that's the way to do it. The only other thing we could do with one-time funds besides acquisitions, really, is you can do short-term rental subsidies. So these are subsidies where they're called rapid rehousing, where you put someone in housing for a couple years and then they take over the rent on their own. Very difficult to do for extremely impoverished people with our rent prices. It works pretty well in other areas where there's cheaper rents. And let's say it's a woman fleeing domestic violence, she gets a job, she's able to, in a working class job, afford rent on her own. Pretty difficult to do in the Bay Area. So the short-term rental subsidies, and then, aside from that, that's pretty much your choices.
So before we get into, how to address street homelessness, I initially was going to start with the premise that we can all agree that permanent supportive housing is the best solution. But as I've sat here and listened to folks, and as I've actually did research for this conversation, there also seems to be an ongoing debate over whether or not that's the case. And the reason for that is when I heard Director McSpadden talk about how a majority of the $600 million that is in the budget is going towards the 15,000 folks who are currently in permanent supportive housing, if we keep building permanent supportive housing for thousands and thousands of people, that's going to start costing billions of dollars a year just to keep folks in the housing we're building for them. So my question is where does it end? I mean, we could house another 10,000 people, But now we need $1.5 billion a year so that all those folks don't go back into street homelessness. So I guess the question for you is like, at what point do we say we have reached the maximum amount of permanent supportive housing that our city budget can fund, and we need to think about other solutions for folks who are unhoused?
Well, that goes back to my original point, which is the federal government needs to step up. I mean, where does it end? It ends when we reinvest in making sure that poor people in this country have a safe and decent place to live. We used to have that commitment. We actually had a law where you had a right in the United States to safe and decent housing. We took that away from folks, and after the Great Depression, we learned a lot of stuff, and we made a lot of mistakes. A lot of the housing that was created, but we know how to do it better now. And so it ends when poor people in the United States have a safe and decent place to call home. We have to address the disparity between incomes and rent, or we'll continue to have large numbers of people experiencing homelessness. What's wrong with that? Beyond the suffering that entails for the individuals who are going through that, we're spending much more money keeping people homeless already. If we look at our numbers, in healthcare costs alone, we spend more money keeping people homeless. And so,
when you say keeping people homeless, what do you mean exactly?
By failed policy and refusing to invest in making sure that that people in the United States have a safe and decent place to call home. That's a non-choice is a choice. We're choosing not to act. Once we gutted and we cut, federal housing by, 78%, we continue to. That was like 4 decades ago. Mm-hmm. Every president, we continue to make that choice, and we're seeing it, and it's horrible for everyone. It's horrible for people who have to witness it. It's even worse for the people who are living it. And so those are choices that we're making. If you're homeless, and and Margot probably talked about this, but you're in all your different areas of medical after being homeless for a period of time, you're 25 years senior your calendar year. So myself as a 50-year-old woman, I'm 56, a 50-year-old woman, I present, but I'm horrible at math, I present as a 75-year-old woman, right? So, diabetes, heart disease, responsiveness, all these different things, a lot of it is due to sleep deprivation. And so we really we're literally killing people. And so this idea that folks are choosing to be homeless and it's like a free and easy lifestyle out there, it's not. It's really rough.
So I'm channeling the person that says, okay, yeah, it would be what should do. The federal government should step in and should make up from lost time and reinvest in housing for everyone and go back to where it was. But we can't rely on that. We don't know. I mean, Build Back Better apparently would have done a lot, but it didn't pass. The state of the Congress is such that it probably won't pass another 2 years. Maybe it could in the next Congress, but it has been, as you said, 40 years since that gutting of the HUD budget, and nothing has changed, or at least not enough to actually make a dent in this issue. And so then we're faced with the reality of, again, the same question. Can we just keep building more and more permanent supportive housing, which with a budget that actually we're seeing a $700 million deficit over the next 2 years? And so the question really is like, you got 8,000 folks in the city who are unhoused. Is there anything that can be done with some expediency within the budget constraints that we have?
Yeah, so the housing, I just want to kind of step back a little bit because you keep saying building permanent supportive housing. So when we talk about permanent supportive housing, there's a number of different elements to that. Permanent supportive housing also includes housing subsidies that you use in the private market that come with support services. Sometimes the subsidy comes from the federal government. We commonly refer to it Section 8. It's not called that anymore, but but we also have local versions of that. And so that we're having a pretty large amount of success. Starting to in San Francisco, had a tremendous amount of success in Los Angeles with this model. We have the construction, which is one piece of it, and I think the argument for construction is the same argument with, we want more housing, right? Because there's, this idea that there's a housing shortage, and so if we're paying to a private landlord, we're not necessarily expanding the pool, so that's another piece of the puzzle. And the acquisitions, as I mentioned, so that's another piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is using our public housing that we have really well. And we've been in kind of a situation for, God, I guess it's like 6 years now, where Ed Lee, which was awesome that this happened, went through the process of rebuilding our public housing, which really needed to happen. So I'm not throwing shade on that at all. What that did though is that they ended up keeping all the vacancies and holding them, so that when they're tearing down one section of housing, they can move the people from that section to the vacants and then rebuild, and then it kind of just keeps going. So we're still on that mode, where we still are not filling our vacancies in public housing. So as soon as that ends, we need to make sure that those, and it'll be a lot of units, it'll be thousands of units, that those units are prioritized for unhoused people.
Wait, so just so I have this right, so there's a set amount of public housing units in the city. Mayor Lee got the money or the approvals to tear them down and build a lot more, like build towers? Is that what happened?
Well, they,
or
so
increase
it's
the
the
number
four
of
big, well, it was a fight to get 1-for-1 replacement, let me just say that. So because what they wanted to do was do mixed income. And so in order to have 1-for-1 replacement at the income levels for the extremely low income people, so less than 30% of area median, basically we're talking about people earning $40,000, $30,000 a year and less, depending on the family size. So they had to, in order to do the mixed income, they had to, and keep the same number of extremely low income units, they had to add units to it. So yeah, the big four housing developments in San Francisco have all been being rebuilt. And so, Bayview, Alice Griffin, Potrero Hill.
Got it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about tents, encampments, and folks living on the street itself. And there's this lawsuit which folks didn't want to talk about last night because it's ongoing. But I think you're actually, you're part of the lawsuit, right? Or
yes, we are the ones.
You're the ones suing.
Yes.
So you're suing the city, or
yes.
Who are you suing? You're suing the city.
Suing the city.
Why are you suing the city? What are you trying to accomplish with the lawsuit?
Yeah. So we are in settlement, so I can't talk about any of that. But I can talk about the broad stuff. So why are we suing the city? So for years, what has been happening is that, well, let me just back it up a little bit to create some context. So when I mentioned the federal government backed out of providing housing for folks, basically what they did by doing that is they left this issue, created this issue, and then left it at the feet of municipal local governments, right? And what the local governments then did, because they didn't have the tax base to actually address it, is that they started using police primarily to move people and kind of manage public space. And that is not unique to San Francisco. That happens all across the country. And it has real consequences for folks. In San Francisco, people get between about, homeless people get between 10,000 and 20,000 citations a year. What typically happens around the country is, homeless people get citations, they can't pay them, they go to warrant, they get notices for court, they're not getting them in the mail because they don't have an address, they don't show up, they get warrants, and they basically spend a weekend in jail to be able to, pay off all those fines. And so it's kind of the modern version of a pauper's prison. So what happened was there was a court case in 2018 called Martin's that basically made a constitutional claim that giving someone a ticket for lodging when they had nowhere to sleep was cruel and unusual punishment, and that was supported in an amicus brief by the Obama's Justice Department. That court case prevailed, and basically what it said was that you can't give people tickets if they don't have any place to live, or a place to be, a shelter bed, or etc. So in San Francisco, we've been for years witnessing the city try to move homeless people from place to place by using a couple of different methods. And one of their methods is property confiscation. And so they come, if they take people's property often out of their hands, they throw it in the dumpster. We did a survey pretty recently here in the Mission last year, just of homeless people in the Mission that the Latino Task Force did. 64% of people responded that they had been swept without being offered a place to live, a place to sleep first, right? That they were forcibly removed without offering a place to stay. 75% had their personal items confiscated by the city. 44% had medications confiscated, okay? So if you're on Medi-Cal and you're trying to replace your medications, okay, really difficult situation for folks. So we had been going to the city over and over again. We negotiated a policy around the property and how to handle it, and what they're supposed to do is bag and tag it and store it for 30 days and people can go and pick it up. They said okay, but then they didn't do the policy, and we basically amounted like years of evidence, and we kept going to the city to try to get them to change, and they wouldn't. So we ended up finally being forced to sue. So we're basically doing 3 different constitutional challenges. We're doing the cruel and unusual punishment one based on Martin's, but we're also doing some other challenges around the illegal property confiscation. What do we want out of it? What we want, call us crazy, is we want an effective street response that actually moves people into housing, into shelter, into treatment, into some place instead of block to block to block to block. We want them to stop taking people's property illegally. So that's why we're suing.
But are there places to bring people? I mean, I think we all would agree that it would be moving someone, spending all this time and money to move someone from 16th to 17th or 18th to 19th is not an ideal solution. But are there actual places to take the person who is living in a tent or on the street? Are there enough beds to move them to right now?
So that's part of the
You
piece.
keep hearing that there's like 1,000-person wait list for shelter beds, right? Like every night.
There's not, because they closed off the shelter. That we don't have any way for people to get shelter in San Francisco because they eliminated that. But before the pandemic, there was 1,000 people on the wait list for shelter. Now we don't know how many.
So if you
we
want a shelter,
obviously would love to use this is part of the leverage of a lawsuit, right? So yes, my investment statement earlier. So invest more in expanding shelter, invest more in expanding housing, invest more in prevention, and use the lawsuit to force them to do that. They have vacant supportive housing units. They have about 1,000 of those units sitting there because of all the rigmarole and paperwork. Meanwhile, people are dying on the streets. Fill those units. I mean, there's so many things that can happen. And so if we're not, this is just another kind of crowbar, so to speak, to kind of get the city to move. So, yeah. So in the situation where they're doing everything and we still don't have a place for folks, I want to the city has done encampment resolutions right, and they've been effective. And I'll just bring up one model.
No, please, I'd love to hear what that looks like.
Yeah, so there was, there's one that I'm going to mention. There's been other ones. This isn't the only one. But we always refer to it as the King Street model. And basically, it was over by the Caltrans, kind of behind it. There was a large encampment of about 50 people who had been there that were pretty well established. I mean, they had a garden, et cetera, et cetera. One of the larger encampments in San Francisco since I've been around. They kept clearing them out. Then people would come back because it was a great little spot. It was really out of the way. Clear them out, come back, clear them out, come back, clear them out, come back. Put up a fence, cut the fence. I mean, it just, it was just like ongoing. Spent a whole bunch of money on all those clearances, just silly. So at that time, Bevan Dufty, who has been a supervisor, et cetera, he was in homeless. We worked together collaboratively with him. Basically, the idea is to spend time with folks, do the assessments, figure out what they want, and then have a process to move people off the streets. And it does take time. Like, you've got to accumulate those resources, right? So what ended up happening in that situation is that brought in a container. People said they wanted, they were really worried about their property and they wanted it protected. They're hanging on to that. It's the kind of thing that happens. People, it's the last things they have in life. put it in a property in the container, and then people could keep what they wanted or get rid of what they wanted. People wanted to be housed together. They had formed a community. They wanted to be together. They ended up having 2 different buildings. People got to self-select which building they wanted to go in. Wasn't ready all at once. It was going to take time. Found an empty church. We got plenty of empty churches in San Francisco. Got the church. It was a black church, you know. Everybody moved into the church and stayed there until the housing units opened up. And then people were able to self-select. One of our street sheet writers ended up getting this really bizarre cancer, and he ended up being able to have his best friend with him who was his caretaker until he passed away.
I think someone might say, after hearing that, like, that sounds great and amazing, but we can't do that for everyone, right? That a city of San Francisco or any city cannot possibly be able to accommodate in that way, with that level of specificity and desire, to anyone that wants it. And someone might say, well, I have to figure out a way to make a life for myself in this town, and I have to find a way to have a job and pay for my apartment, and you know, why should other folks who can't afford it get congregant living and a box with all their stuff in it? And you know, we can't accommodate everyone. We have to have rules, we have to have laws. You can't sleep on the street, and I'm sorry that you want to have your own unit and a place where you can access your things, but we can't do that for you. But you can't be here. So again, I'm channeling like what someone might say. So
well, that's been the idea, right? I mean, that has been our homeless policy. We enforce. We make it as uncomfortable as possible for people with the idea that they'd simply disappear. We have currently today 40% of our jail population is unhoused on petty stuff. So we're already doing that. That's not working. So what I'm saying is status quo sucks. Let's do something different. If we don't have enough resources for people, what are other things that we can do? For one thing, we can expand the investments, we can do it over a period of time, and we can build to it. It's not going to be an overnight thing. We got to make sure that there's bathrooms for folks. We got to make sure that there's good garbage service. A lot of times there's a lot of illegal dumping that's happening near folks. I mean, all of these things, and really making sure that if we're not able to house somebody today, we're working closely with them so that they have their immediate needs met, that there's not more harm done to them, keeping them as safe as we can, and then until that day when a unit opens up and they can move in.
Okay.
And that is sort of like there's not like a magic bullet that we can suddenly say, because we don't have control over the federal government, et cetera, that we can't just snap our fingers and say, all right, this is going to disappear. But enforcement doesn't work. We're already doing that. We have been doing it. It doesn't work.
So a question about property and about space. So, I'll now take I'm channeling person hot and put my actual Manny Kutil hat on. A situation that we had a week ago. There was a gentleman that we know in this neighborhood, in this community, and he had 5 shopping carts full of things tied up together on the corner, blocking the street all the way down in front of La Cumbre, and taking both sides of the street, so you had to walk in between. And I spoke to the man, and I said, it's a lot of things that's blocking the street, like, maybe we can figure out a better place for it. And he said, this is all my stuff. All of this is mine. No one can touch it. But it wasn't things to live in or medication. It was literally like broken microwaves and cardboard boxes and like shoes that I'm convinced this man was not wearing those shoes. They were stilettos. So like, I was like, well, you don't want to throw away someone's possessions, but for the person that might be walking down the street, you're like, well, some of these possessions don't seem like they're things to live with, but they're just taking up space. And so in that environment where someone is claiming ownership over things, the city came and they said, we cannot remove anything or even touch it because the gentleman is saying, these are my possessions. But in my perspective, I was like, I totally get that. I don't want to throw away your medication or even a tent that you're living in. But 5 shopping carts full of household items that you're not going to use, at what point, where do you draw the line of what is acceptable to hold on the street?
Well, I mean, I think, so probably I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that individual has a hoarding problem. which is a condition that there is medication available for. And so, you know, trying to work with the person, and there's all kinds of strategies. That's one of the most difficult issues. It's difficult for folks in housing. A lot of people lose their housing because of hoarding. And it's pretty complicated, and I've been pretty close to some people that had really big issues with that, including, like, you know, there's a house person who's a friend of mine, and he would not get rid of his urine or his, you know, number two. And it takes, you know, basically he needed some intensive mental health work and to be able to get there.
I totally hear that. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, with public space, with space that all of us have to use, and it's a delicate question. It's a question of, like, where do we say in a society or in this city, how much public space can we allocate to folks who are suffering? And at what point do you say, like I heard in Berkeley, there's like a square footage that folks can use. There, you know, if you're in a situation where you're sleeping on the street, there's an amount of space that you can take up. I think when folks drive by or walk by a tent encampment, the ones that I hear about are like where the tent takes up the entire sidewalk, where you cannot walk, and you have to walk into the street around it. And some folks see that and said, there's being compassionate, and then there's having no rules whatsoever.
Right. Well, so from a legal perspective, you know, blocking the sidewalk is blocking the sidewalk, and so if you can't physically get past it, then you're violating that particular ordinance.
And what should happen in that case in a city?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like our lawsuit and all that stuff, it doesn't even touch that stuff like that. You know, that there's nothing preventing the city from enforcing on those kinds of things.
But how do you do that? If there's a tent literally on the way here, I saw a tent that took over the entire sidewalk, and I saw people walk into the street around it.
Yeah. Like,
does the city say, excuse me, you can camp here, but just your tent has to be half the size? And they'll say, well, I don't have a tent half the size. And they say, well, what is the mechanism to? Obviously, King Street would be the best, but in the short, and that's absent that, how should the city try to clear a sidewalk that is taken over?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, they can enforce on that, and they can have those conversations. But typically, you know, for me, when I'm in conversations with folks, it's, you know, usually can, you know, it's these things in terms of how do we coexist in space and make it work for everybody. And I think really coming at things from a respectful perspective, and an understanding and a place of love and just treating each other like human beings and trying to problem solve. You know, we have very little storage for folks, and you know, it would be very convenient for folks to be able to have storage that they can access and come in and out of. The storage that the city does provide is very limited, and it has very limited hours, and you can only, you know, bring certain things in and certain things out, and there's just like all this thing. So I mean, I think that there's some kind of common sense ways to try to address a lot of these things. And then some things you're gonna have these rare situations, they're gonna take a lot more work, and you know, sometimes it's gonna take more time and getting to know somebody and building trust, and then trying to have those hard conversations. But that's more the exception. The typical situation is we can figure out how to coexist and issues can be addressed. A lot of times, like when people have large amounts of property and there's just like crap, you know, you have a conversation with them like, what's, you know, I mean, I live in this neighborhood, and so, you know, what's up with all this stuff? And people will be like, oh my God, somebody keeps dumping all their crap here. Can you help me? And I was like, yeah, I can do, I'm allowed to do one pickup a year. And so let me call and I'll figure it out. And they're like, thank you so much. And then we'll, you know, and then we put it in the right spot and put the right notice on it, and the city comes and picks it up, and we get, you know, I mean, there's solutions to this stuff that don't have to be, we're gonna tear the property from your hands and throw it in a crusher and, you know, threaten you with arrest. Like, that doesn't have to be the approach.
Yeah, I want to go back to enforcement, and then we're gonna get to audience questions in about 5 minutes. And it's clear there are neighborhoods in San Francisco where we won't see a lot of folks sleeping on the street in a tent or otherwise, and then there are areas of San Francisco where you'll see a lot of them. A lot of folks sleeping on the street in tents. And so when you make the claim like we do enforcement and it doesn't work, it seems like we do, there are areas where we enforce more or more strictly, or where if someone were to sleep on a tent on say Pacific Avenue, that tent would not last very long. But at 16th and Mission, or lots of other parts of San Francisco, there'll be a tent there and no one seems to do anything, quote, do anything about it. And so I guess I question a little bit whether or not we're doing enforcement right, because it seems like there's areas of San Francisco where we're not really doing a whole lot of enforcement at all.
Yeah, so it's important to understand homelessness in the context of poverty, and there is a percentage of people that are extremely poor in the United States that experience homelessness. It's typically between 7 and 9%. And so, and typically, folks are staying in the communities that they have an ante where they can use a shower, or they are able to stay this amount of time at their friend's place, or this is more the reason, rather than enforcement, of why you see in impoverished areas. You also have a much higher percentage of people of color. We have 5% of our city is African American, 40% of our homeless population, 50% of our homeless family population is African American. We had a 55% increase in Latino folks experiencing homelessness on this last big count. A lot of that here in the Mission, folks who were essential workers or lost work. That were restaurant workers that closed down, not essential workers, but restaurant workers who shut down, then became homeless. And so, we had this, we have to remember it in that kind of context. What happens with enforcement, and this is an interesting thing, because we had a theory, and so we did this big study with the guy from UC Berkeley, and we had a theory that there was sweeps that were going on in one area, and so in another area, we were seeing an increase in unhoused people. And so we wanted to kind of dig into that and see what effect enforcement was having. And we were totally wrong. What we found is that people weren't moving more than a block away from where they were forced to leave. And so when we have the impression that enforcement isn't happening, because people don't have anywhere to go, and they come back, and that, like, people have a sense of home. And as human beings, we're just like natural nesters, and people will stay in that area. And that's what's actually happening. And so I think that is more the issue than the enforcement piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
My last question is about we've talked a lot about the percentage of people who are San Franciscans that become homeless versus people who come here. And again, there's this perception that San Francisco is people come here who are homeless or about to be homeless or became homeless somewhere else because of all the services we provide. There are people who say because of our more relaxed attitudes towards drug use. And if you have a drug problem, you think, well, I can do it in San Francisco and nothing's going to happen to me. And what's been mentioned is that about 30% of folks in the last 2022 point in time count indicated that they were not from San Francisco, and another 15% or so said that they had only moved to San Francisco within the last year, which is about 45% of folks. And so I don't actually think it matters if it's 40%, 20%, 60%. The fact that there are, and if you take that and there's 8,000 folks, that's 3,000, 3,500 people who, quote unquote, are not San Franciscans. They're not one of our own. They've come here, and they are homeless on our streets. And so I'm just channeling here. I'm just saying what people might be saying with it, not on the mic in front of everyone else. Why should we bend over backwards and put lockers and spend all this money and time and energy and tens of millions of dollars of money to help someone who's not a San Franciscan who is suffering? Why should we do it? Why shouldn't another city do it? Or why should they be allowed to be here? It's our street. It's affecting our quality of life.
So the allowed part, okay. So
I
love this question. I love this question. All right.
And if you think I'm the only one that says that, then you are wrong. Because a lot of people
No. I know. I've done a couple speaking engagements before.
Not you.
So,
I know you know.
So I think, yeah, so all right. So this is another thing we have to think about in a national perspective. So every city in the United States, Chicago, freezing cold winters. I haven't spent any time there, so I don't know, but I think it's pretty cold there. Las Vegas, people coming there for the winter, right? And everything in between. Everybody thinks they're, I used to be the director of the coalition in San Mateo County, and all 21 cities down there think they're a magnet. I swear to God. So everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks it. Okay, so what does the facts tell us? So there is a portion of people who are unhoused who move around. Why do they move around? They move around for the same migratory reasons as anyone else, for family and jobs, right? So we're in a city, so like every other city, we have a slightly larger number of people who come from outside than in like rural areas and suburban areas where people tend to, you know, stay there. So it's a little bit, in cities, you have a lot of folks. I bet not everybody here was born here in San Francisco. I'm going to take a guess. So with the homeless population, you have this percentage that in every municipality, it's the same thing. Las Vegas was, you know, did the study. They found it wasn't true. People weren't coming there for the winter. Chicago, you know, in all these places. So for the people who are coming, typically, they're not long-term homeless folks. They're not going to be able to get housing here because...
I think that's you.
Sorry, I thought I turned my phone off.
That's okay. This is a no-shame space. You can take a second and
okay.
Turn it off if you want.
I know who it is. It's my hubby because I recognize the ringtone.
Do you want to pick it up? I don't want to. You want to talk to me?
So I think so we know we don't have more people coming to San Francisco than in other municipalities. We have the same portion, right? And we also have our system set up where you have to demonstrate that you're homeless in San Francisco for a long period of time before you can qualify for housing. It's actually, at this point, it's about 15 years homeless before you can get housing.
Wait, you have to demonstrate that you've been homeless in San Francisco for 15 years?
Yeah, through coordinated entry, yeah.
To get housing?
To get housing,
okay.
Yeah, through the homeless system.
Not that you had lived here in housing for 15 years.
Okay. Homeless, yeah. So it's pretty hard. So this idea that people are coming here for service, you know, I mean, that's, so I think, I also want to mention everywhere in the United States is having a major opioid crisis. I mean, we are not unique in that. And I know Fox News likes to pretend like we are, but if you look at the overdoses, I mean, I don't care if you're like in the rural area of Tennessee or, I mean, this is seriously, like, it's an issue. And I mean, opioids and, you know, and all the pill factory, I mean, all that stuff that happened, like this is a major, you know, horrible thing that happened with our, you know, with our pharmaceutical companies and all that stuff that happened there. So, so the magnet theory has been disproven over and over again. I will say though, it is very convenient line for our policymakers to put out there. And every one of our mayors, regardless of their stripes, has used this same trope because it lets themselves off the hook. We're doing everything possible, but everybody keeps coming in from outside, so we shouldn't do any more. And it totally lets them off the hook. And that has been said so often and so repeatedly in our media, it has literally permeated our consciousness. And the same thing happens in everywhere else. And so everyone is thinking this. And so it's one of those myths that it's not that hopeful. And I would say, regardless of that, every human being is deserving of dignity, and every human being is deserving of a safe place to call home. And I firmly believe that with all my heart.
All right, let's get to audience questions. The quick ask, because I know I went over, and I'm sorry, is to try to keep your questions to a minute at least, and have it actually be a question if you can. Let's go to the person with the striped sweater. Angelina's going to hold the mic in front of you. We'll try to get to as many
So many
questions.
questions. This is so fun.
Could you talk about the benefits cliff? So that's when someone is getting subsidized housing and then they get a raise and then they no longer qualify for subsidized housing, but they aren't making enough to make up for that.
Okay, and actually pause if you don't mind, Jennifer. We're gonna do round robin in the beginning because I bet there's a bunch of questions. So okay, since you're there, let's go to Eric right here.
Oh, like a bunch of questions. And
We're gonna do three. We're just gonna do three. And can we get a
like
pen for Jennifer as well? Do we have a pen? Anyone got a pen? Oh, we got a pen.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, this way we can just get through more questions and you can, the answers can be a little bit.
What models of market rate or market rate-ish housing development would you like to see in San Francisco to address the price of rent?
What's your thoughts on market rate housing? What amount of market rate housing? Let's go to Bob the builder here, Bob the Castro handyman.
My friend John lives in a sanctioned homeless encampment at Shotwell and Cesar Chavez. It's very well run, very well organized. There are 30 well-behaved people there. In the industrial section of San Francisco, there are empty warehouses that could be leased by the city. They could get tents off the streets into these warehouses as sanctioned homeless tent communities.
Okay, so benefits cliff, market rate housing, and sanctioned encampment sites in the warehouses in the industrial part of the city.
Yeah, on the benefits cliff, that is, it affects like in a myriad of different ways. So it affects when people have welfare and they basically get their grant reduced when they're working, so it's almost a punishment for working. And then there's other benefits that are attached to that, like childcare. And so it does create like this huge problem when folks, you know, like you work, you have your childcare, and then you basically lose everything once your income gets too high. And so there has been some policy changes that have addressed that, where there's more bridge time and they've increased income levels in different programs. But I do agree with you that that continues to be an issue for sure and could be pretty easily remedied.